Hello and welcome to the World Wonders podcast. I'm Ryan.
I'm Amanda and we're your hosts.
And today we're going to be sharing with you our top tools and methods for learning Spanish.
Yes, specifically we're going to talk about 5 of them and we're going to do it nice and quick.
But yeah, 5 top ones and then some also other bonus ones. So
if
after
you're lucky.
10 minutes of podcast, your Spanish learning will be supercharged.
Yes, you're going to leave feeling inspired and ready to learn some Spanish or another language, perhaps.
So if you've been listening to some of the other episodes, we talked about how we were backpacking in South America for 6 months at the start of this year.
Last year,
2014. And so going down, we were practicing a bit of Spanish beforehand. We bought Rosetta Stone and spent like $500 on that and then proceeded to use it for like 2 weeks. And then when we got down there, we found a tutor, did some language lessons, kind of built up like a general vocabulary to order food in restaurants and say, how's it going? Hello. Maybe like, what's that? I think kind of plateaued really. And it seemed to take us a while to get some traction, to find tools that we really liked, that really helped us to start learning at a faster pace and stop plateauing, get out of that plateau.
Yeah, for sure. And as well as to help us to gain confidence and to actually enjoy the language learning process along the way.
Yeah. And I felt beforehand like, oh, I got to get down into these countries where they speak Spanish for me to learn. And now after doing that, I realized there was a ton of options available to be learning before I went. So if you are on a trip in a Spanish country right now, these tools would be great for you. But if you're thinking about going in 6 months, like by all means, like start up in advance, because the farther you are when you start, it's just easier when you get down there.
For sure.
So the first tool, and the thing I recommend to anyone I hear is going down to South America, is the Michael Thomas method, or Michel. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce his name.
It's like kind of in between maybe.
Yeah, so it's MICHELTHOMAS.com to find all his things. And he's he's done programs for a ton of languages, but what makes his program special is that it's not following the basic formula of teaching you the basics and building a solid foundation and this wide, so many standard language programs are focused on the wide breadth of stuff instead of like, oh, you got to learn this before you learn this, before you learn this. And Michel Thomas is like, the first thing he talks about is how 4,000 words in Spanish are the same as English. And that conversational Spanish, you really only need to know a few hundred words in the first place. Mm-hmm. And he gets you speaking full sentences within 30 minutes. And so you get that feeling of a reward that gets you really addicted and makes you feel like you're progressing.
Yeah, and he gives you really cool like methods to really help you learn things instead of just like conjugating verbs and writing verb after verb after verb. He gives you better ways to group them together, and it just seems like your brain can understand it better, which is awesome.
Yeah, and I think he bases his teaching on human beings, whereas a lot of other teaching seems to be based on like, oh, if you could teach a computer this, how would you do it? Teach it all this technical information. And he's like, oh, what do humans need to know to progress?
For sure.
And like, what can you use? What makes it easier for you? And so if he makes it easier for you to get into a conversation, then naturally you're going to be pulled into speaking better Spanish.
Yeah, definitely. So that's method number 1. Method number 2 is called the Mimic method.
Yeah, the Mimic method is a really cool program. It's not very well known, but the idea behind it is that to learn to speak a language, it's not so important to learn how to read and write and understand, the grammar so much as like, I think he calls it feeling the flow of the language. So what you're doing in this program, which is a little bit more expensive than the Michael Thomas method, I think it's like $90 to buy it, but you're rapping songs in Spanish and then they're analyzing your sound clips and telling you where to correct them, and you're learning how to pronounce all the sounds in Spanish properly and learning how to pick out sounds when you're hearing.
Yeah, and that's actually a really cool method, because one of the problems I had in being in South America and Spain, Mexico, anywhere that speaks Spanish, is that even when I get the courage to say something and to speak up, a lot of the time they don't understand what I'm saying. And so the mimic method is really good at correcting that accent, because they teach you how to pronounce the words in Spanish, and then they work through it with you to tell you what you're saying incorrectly.
Yeah.
Which is awesome.
Yeah. It's very well laid out to keep it fun, to keep it interesting. And if you haven't had any experience with written Spanish, I'd suggest doing something like that beforehand, because one of the things that's confusing, if you speak English, you look at Spanish words and you see that they're the same letters, and you use your English sounds for those letters, but those letters actually indicate different sounds in Spanish. So you think of hablar, and then you can't get that, you can't shake that, versus hablar, or whatever you pronounce it in Spanish.
That's great, isn't it?
Yeah.
Don't be so confident in yourself.
Anyways, next method.
So one thing that we found really handy is podcasts. A few that we have listened to, Notes in Spanish is a really good one. They haven't continued it, but it's a lady who's from Madrid, and she teaches a British guy how to speak Spanish. And it's interesting if you kind of follow along, because his Spanish gets really, really good. And it's like, how can a British dude speak such good Spanish? But they, start slow, break it down, get faster and faster. And it's a great podcast.
Yeah, they've got 3 different series. There's Notes in Spanish Beginner, Notes in Spanish Intermediate, Notes in Spanish Advanced. So the beginner features a bit of English. Intermediate and advanced are just them talking in Spanish, but they're talking slow enough that you can start to understand the words and pick it out. And that's kind of a common theme with the other 2 methods you talked about before, just like getting that exposure to the language. So you start to develop the muscles, as you would say, to hear it and to speak it. So getting Notes in Spanish, that's a great podcast. And then once you get a little bit farther, and even I'd say before that, even when you don't understand a single word, I think there's some value in just like listening to the language. So if you're big into any particular topic, you can find those topics in your language of choice. So for Spanish, if you're into sports, you can find ESPN Deportes has an entire lineup of podcasts.
Deportes means sports, FYI. You just learned a Spanish word.
No, I knew that, but that's what ESPN Deportes is, like Spanish ESPN.
I was talking to our listeners.
Oh.
Not you.
Mm-hmm.
That's awkward.
And then another good one is Voice of America. It's kind of like an American news network, maybe some sort of propaganda thing, but they offer podcasts in like any language. So even if you're not learning Spanish, you can find a news podcast in your language of choice.
Yeah, so definitely a good way, especially if you are traveling. You're going to spend a lot of time on buses, trains, planes, taxis, all forms of transportation. Maybe you might ride a chicken or 2. We'll maybe talk about that in a future episode. But it's just a really great thing if you've got a little iPod or your iPhone to just download some podcasts, and you can just have that Spanish kind of getting into your brain all the time. Another method that's really awesome is the idea of a conversation exchange. And one website that's really great is called italki. So it's actually the letter I and then talk and then another I.com. And we'll put that on the show notes, of course. But you can actually sign up for free. You can meet people from around the world with for all different languages. And for Spanish, there's lots of people who want to exchange for English, which is really cool.
Yeah, and you can practice your written language on there. People will correct you like immediately after you post something, or find someone to Skype with. And if you want to take it to the next level, there's people offering to teach you for small amounts of money. Yeah, there's also one called Conversation Exchange. I don't know what the website is, but if you Google Conversation Exchange, and that's to link up in person or by Skype, but people seem to use it for in-person meetups. If you're in your city, in whatever country you're in, odds are there's a Spanish immigrant there who wants to practice his English, get to know people, and then gives you a great opportunity to practice Spanish. And when you're traveling, you can meet a local, teach them some English, practice your Spanish, get a cool experience.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a really, really great way. Like if you can learn from somebody who is local and provide them that service back with your native language, I think that that's just such a cool opportunity to interact with somebody from another country and to practice a language.
Mm-hmm. And then the last of the 5 is...
This one is groundbreaking. Just wait for it.
Kids movies.
Kids movies.
Yeah. Kind of like we were talking about before, just immersing yourself in the language is a brilliant way to learn and start to absorb, because as a human, you're going to naturally pick up things. Kids movies are so simple, especially animated movies. They're really designed them so that you don't have to listen to them. You can get the story because it's like those kind of common stories you've seen all throughout history, repeated and again, over and over again.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because when you think about a kid's movie, I mean, it's designed for perhaps like a 3 to 7-year-old brain, and a 3-year-old is not overly conversational. I mean, they can't read, they don't understand what the characters as letters mean in a language. And so, you know, if you come in as an adult, you're going to understand what's happening in the movie, even if you don't understand the entire dialogue. And we went to Rio 2 or Rio Dos while we were in Argentina, and it's fast. Like the Spanish is really fast, and I definitely did not understand the actual vocabulary for the most part. There was some stuff that I did get, but I know exactly what happened in Rio Dos. So it's a pretty cool way to just like listen to the language, listen to the pronunciation, pick out some words, learn some new words, and just have some entertainment and keep that language learning fun.
Yeah, and if you're at home, it's easy to find copies of all the popular movies dubbed and changed into Spanish or whatever other language you might be wanting to learn. And it's fun too. Like kids' movies are generally pretty good. Like if you can find the Lego movie in Spanish, I definitely recommend that one.
Everything is awesome.
Yeah, so I think the key theme with all the methods is that just realizing that if you keep it fun, then you're going to stick with it. I think that's one of the things we encountered while we were traveling, trying to do it in more of a traditional way at the start, and just like not doing it, feeling guilty, and then you really stop doing it once you start feeling guilty.
Yeah, and I think too, you know, there's this idea that you have to build this strong foundation. You have to know all these vocabulary words, and that you have to know exactly what you're trying to say before you can say it. And it really doesn't have to be like that. You can kind of just like piece sentences together, try your best, say what you do know, you know, use hand gestures if you have to. People are willing to help you out when you're trying. And I feel like trying is so much better than not trying.
And that's the point you're bringing up about just kind of fumbling your way through it. It's really scary to do that. So many of us are, like, so for myself, like I had quite a bit of social anxiety, so I'm afraid of what people think about me. I want to look good. I want to have this Spanish thing perfected in like my bedroom before I take it out into the real world. And like that's not the reality of how you learn something. You learn something by going out and practicing. So it's almost bigger to overcome that social anxiety than actually doing the like book work.
Yeah, totally.
So we're going to have links to all the stuff we mentioned and even a couple more things, a couple extra tips, all on our show notes on theworldwanderers.com.
Yeah, and if you have any questions about the way we've learned Spanish or any suggestions or things that you would add to our quick list, feel free to email us at theworldwandererspodcast@gmail.com.
Hasta luego.
Ciao.